Aliens are real. Is this a thesis sentence? Well, I would say it's a thesis sentence in need of a little sharpening. So this video will take us through a few examples and try to try to give you a little insight into how to kind of sharpen up a thesis sentence into something that sounds like it should be in an essay, something that sounds a little formal, something that sounds, educated and rational. So, looking back to the idea I mentioned a couple of videos ago about having a thesis about the existence of aliens. If you just say aliens are real, in some sense, this just isn't quite focused enough to be a good thesis sentence, right? Um, it is taking a stand, and it could be phrased as a con. You could say aliens are not real. But, what's the difference between saying something like aliens are real versus saying there is substantial evidence that alien life does exist in our universe? Well, for one thing, you're never going to be utterly proving that aliens are real in an essay. But you could be proving to a reader that there's a lot of good evidence that alien life might exist. Do you see the difference there? So start thinking in terms of, making things a little more clear than something this short can be. Make sure you're not answering or arguing for something that's very hard to really answer. Like the question about alien life won't be answered definitively until, we find alien life or a giant spaceship lands and aliens walk out of it, right? So one essay can't really resolve one way or another on this topic. But you can take a stand in an essay and make an argument for why it's a good belief and a rational belief to believe that alien life exists. Right, so take something like peer pressure can be negative. Again, notice that this is very short, just like the last one we had. And in a way, it's taking a stand, and in a way, you could phrase it as its opposite, as a pro. You could say peer pressure can be positive. But why is this, again, not quite sharpened enough as a thesis sentence? For one thing, would anyone really disagree with this? Is anyone going to truly disagree? Is it truly up for debate that peer pressure can be negative? Only a sort of very irrational person would say that peer pressure could never appear in a negative form, right? So although you would be arguing for this point of view, it's kind of more common sense than, an issue that has different sides to debate. So let me take the same topic, but take us to this sentence, which would be a good essay thesis sentence. Interestingly, peer pressure is an unimportant factor in later patterns of drug use. Now, this sounds very specific compared to the first one, right? So this is the type of thesis sentence. If someone found, say, an essay that showed this, and I think this came from a student example I had a few years back where someone had read an essay about how, drug use was studied, addiction was studied, and it turned out that there was a lot of evidence that peer pressure during the formative years was not that important as to who ended up becoming addicted to drugs. Why is that interesting? As the word itself in here says, interestingly, it's interesting because it kind of goes against common sense. So do you see how compared to peer pressure can be negative, That's just basically common sense that almost anyone would agree with. Whereas this sentence, interestingly, peer pressure is an unimportant factor in later patterns of drug use. This is interesting because it kind of cuts against our common sense. And so as a reader of this essay, I would be interested to see, can the writer convince me that peer pressure is not important in later drug use patterns? Because intuitively, I would kind of assume that peer pressure is important, right? So if they can have this as a thesis sentence and then give me a few really good points of evidence as to why peer pressure is unimportant, we're heading towards an interesting essay, right? Because if you think about it, an essay, we want to have our minds changed by an essay, don't we? Or we at least want to be offered a perspective that's different from the standard perspective or different from common sense on an issue. So let's see, like I have this other example here. So this is from a couple of years ago, but it's still probably relevant. When we talk about anonymous here, I mean the hacker collective, if it could be called that. Here, I just found this interesting because here are two perfectly good thesis sentences. One is the pro, one is the con. And notice that the only thing different between them is one word. Okay, so we have Anonymous's hacking activities are beneficial to our democracy, meaning they're good for it, they benefit it. So we have a kind of pro thesis sentence here. Versus Anonymous's hacking activities are damaging to our democracy. In other words, they hurt the democracy in some way. And both of these are a good thesis sentence because I don't know if Anonymous's hacking activities are good or bad for the democracy. I don't know if anyone knows, whether the net effects are good or bad. Therefore, both of these are an interesting perspective to try to argue for the issue. And I liked how kind of neat that was, that you can just shift from a pro word, beneficial, to a con word, damaging. And every other word is the same, but right there you have the pro and the con version of this thesis sentence. All right. Let me, pull up this. So here is an example of a student thesis sentence I got underlined up at the top. And by the way, I will ask us to underline our thesis sentence when we turn in our essay. You'll notice that's a requirement for this assignment. And I want us to do that just so everyone makes sure they're really focused on what their thesis sentence is and what the direction their essay should be heading in is. So that will be a requirement. So here we have an underlined thesis sentence. The death penalty is controversial, unconstitutional, and costly. So then it's followed by the comments that I wrote to this student. Let me just read this out loud and then I'll expand on it a little. Great topic. I think you were heading in the right direction, but I want to sharpen your thesis into a bit more of what we called taking a stand. In other words, I'd go with something like, the death penalty should be abolished in the United States. Then in the essay, you can write about the reasons that it is unconstitutional, controversial, and how costly it is. Each of these ideas can be a paragraph or two in the essay, and they all support the thesis that the death penalty should be abolished. Another point is the issue of the possibility of innocent people being executed. I suppose this might fall under the controversial aspect of the death penalty. Okay, so do you see how the version of the thesis sentence that I put up has a little bit more punch to it? It really takes a stand. The death penalty should be abolished in the United States. That is a pro statement. You're saying something that should be done. And then the con would be what? The death penalty should not be abolished in the United States, or something like the death penalty should be maintained. That would be the opposite of this statement. Now, here's a good lesson about this. You do not have to explain the reasons why. You don't have to explain your evidence in your thesis sentence. That's what the rest of the essay is for. So all you have to do is clearly take a stand and clearly state your point of view. And then later, you can illustrate the evidence for why it's true in the meat of the essay and the paragraphs that come after the thesis sentence. So let's again look at the student example at the top. The death penalty is controversial, unconstitutional, and costly. In a sense, what's happening here is the student is listing some reasons why the death penalty should be abolished, but they're not clearly stating it should be abolished. So if it's unconstitutional, that would be a great paragraph of evidence for why it should be abolished. Do you see the difference I'm talking about? If it's costly, which it is, by the way, no matter where you stand on this issue, right? It's incredibly costly to keep people on death row and execute them. And that's taxpayer money, right? So there's an argument against the death penalty. In other words, a reason that it should be abolished might be the cost of it. So this student is kind of summarizing their evidence in the thesis sentence. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is clearly state your point of view, right? And then this word controversial. In a sense, I'm looking at that now, it's like that really doesn't need to be in here because no one is arguing that it's not controversial. Do you see what I'm saying? That's not the argument about the death penalty, whether it's controversial or not. No matter where you fall on the death penalty, you know it's a controversial issue, right? Because there's a vigorous debate about this issue in our society. So that, in a sense, does not even need to be said at any point in the thesis sentence. And it's not really something that needs to be explored because it falls down to, again, this idea of pro or con. We know the death penalty is controversial. So now take a stand, either pro or con death penalty. Does that make sense? And so notice that if we go to my version of the thesis sentence, what I'm calling the sharpened version, the death penalty should be abolished in the United States. Right there, we've gone beyond the common sense fact that it's controversial, and we've taken a stand. It should be abolished, right? And so then after this, we could proceed to points of evidence why it should be abolished. Because it costs a lot, because it's unconstitutional, possibly. I don't know if that's true. I'm just saying that's an argument that could be made. Because of, you could argue that taking a life as a penalty for taking life is hypocritical, right? There's all kinds of arguments for why it should be abolished. And there's arguments for why it should be maintained. All right, I think that was good for one video. Hopefully this has offered some perspective on how to kind of sharpen up and arrive at a good thesis sentence.